April 1943. The English coast lay under a veil of cold mist, the kind that clung to every steel surface and soaked through a man's bones. Dawn came slow over the airfield, pale, uncertain, almost reluctant. The distant hum of engines had long since faded. The hangars stood silent, their bellies empty, their purpose drained. For weeks, the fuel convoys had stopped coming. German U-boats haunted the Atlantic like wolves, cutting every line that fed the war machine. What little petrol remained was rationed to the front. To the fighters, to the bombers, to the desperate last missions no one wanted to fly. And so, on the edge of this forgotten base, in a small workshop that smelled of rust and rain, an engineer stood before an impossible problem. His name was Thomas Hale, 29 years old, a man of quiet intelligence and stubborn hope. He had been trained in peacetime to design machines that made life easier. Now, his designs were meant to keep men alive. But his engines, like everything around him, were starving. The gauges read empty. The drums, once filled with aviation fuel, echoed hollow when struck. He stood in the grey light, staring at a row of grounded aircraft. Their wings slick with dew, their propellers motionless. The silence was heavier than any explosion. It was the silence of defeat creeping in, one droplet of oil at a time. Thomas rubbed the grease from his hands and pressed his palm against the side of an engine. The metal was cold, unresponsive. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Don't give up on me now." But it wasn't the machine giving up. It was the world around it. Every calculation he'd made, every diagram he'd drawn, every sleepless night spent over blueprints, meant nothing without fuel. The war was burning itself dry. He knew it. The officers knew it. Even the pilots pacing the airfield knew it. A bomber was no more deadly than a paperweight, without what kept its heart beating. Reports had arrived from London. Fuel reserves were down to a fraction. Convoys were stalled. Even the great engines of industry had begun to choke. If they couldn't find an alternative soon, the skies over Europe would fall silent. And so, Thomas had been given a task no sane man would accept. Find a way to make these engines run. On anything. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. The first week passed in frustration. He tried alcohol blends, too weak. Compressed gases, too unstable. Synthetic compounds, too unpredictable to produce in the field. Each test ended the same way. A sputter, a hiss, a cough of black smoke, and failure. The men in uniform who came to check on his progress left shaking their heads. "It's no use," they said. "You can't fight chemistry." Thomas didn't answer them. He just kept writing numbers, filling the edges of his notebook with formulas, sketches, impossible ratios. He knew the odds. But he also knew something the officers didn't. Machines don't care about odds. They care about solutions. The workshop had become his world. Day bled into night without distinction. The walls were lined with jars of strange mixtures. Oils, solvents, powdered carbon, bits of wire coiled like snakes. The floor was littered with failed experiments. Charred filters, cracked glass, scraps of cloth stiff with residue. He slept on a cot beside the workbench, waking to the drip of condensation from the ceiling. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear the engines, the memory of them. The steady rhythm. The mechanical heartbeat that had once filled the air with purpose. He missed that sound. He needed it back. One night, as the wind howled across the coast, he climbed onto the wing of a grounded bomber. The metal creaked beneath his boots. He looked out over the field, rows of silent aircraft stretching into the fog. He imagined them alive again, propellers spinning, the ground trembling beneath them. And then, as his breath fogged the air, the weight of it all sank in. The war had made demands that logic couldn't meet. It asked men to fly without fuel, to fight without bullets, to believe without proof. And here he was, one man against the laws of physics, armed with nothing but stubbornness and a pencil. When he climbed down, his boots splashed in puddles of rainwater mixed with the last traces of oil. The surface shimmered faintly under the lamplight. He watched it swirl, thin and rainbowed. forming shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. He didn't know it yet, but in that puddle, in that shimmering film, lay the beginning of an idea. For now, he was just tired. He wiped his hands, returned to his bench, and opened his logbook. The pages were smudged, torn, but full of determination. He wrote, "There must be another source, something common, something overlooked." He tapped the pencil against the margin. His mind drifted to the mess hall, to the smell that clung to the corridors after every meal. Fried meats, burnt fat, the lingering trace of cooking oil. It was nothing. A nuisance the cooks scraped into barrels behind the kitchen. And yet, it burned, didn't it? He dismissed the thought for now. There were too many failures already crowding his table. He returned to his calculations, the lamp flickering above him, the night pressing against the windows. Outside, the tide rolled in. Waves crashed against the cliffs, steady and eternal. Inside, the engineer fought his own tide. Of exhaustion, of doubt, of the slow erosion of hope. Each dawn brought new desperation. Officers came with updates. Grim, clipped sentences about supply lines and retreating forces. Every report carried the same refrain. No fuel, no movement, no chance. The commanding officer, Colonel Barrett, paid him a visit one morning. He was a tall man, built from command and caffeine. His boots shone even in the mud. He walked the workshop floor, scanning the mess with a mixture of disdain and pity. "Still nothing?" he asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not yet." Barrett exhaled, the sound halfway between a sigh and a growl. "You're a good man, Hale. But we need results, not theories. Headquarters won't wait much longer." "I'm close," Thomas lied. "Just a few more tests." Barrett's eyes softened for a moment, a rare mercy. "You've got a week. After that, we shut this place down." When the colonel left, the silence returned, heavier than before. A week, 7 days to defy reality. He turned back to the bench, staring at the glass jar before him. It held a thick, amber liquid. A failed attempt at distilling alcohol from potatoes. The smell made his eyes water. He poured it out into the sink and watched it spiral down the drain, bubbling faintly. The room filled with the scent of rot and failure. That night the rain came again. Harder. The roof leaked onto his notes, smearing the ink into unreadable shadows. He didn't bother to stop it. He just sat there, listening to the steady drip, each drop marking another second lost. He thought of his father, a machinist before the war. A man who used to say, "There's no such thing as useless metal, only lazy hands." Thomas wondered what he'd think now, of his son, surrounded by broken engines and empty barrels. But even in despair, there was a rhythm to his thoughts. A kind of quiet defiance that refused to be extinguished. He tore a fresh page from his notebook. He wrote a single word at the top, combustion. Then below it, what burns when all else fails. He listed everything he could think of. Coal, dust, alcohol, rubber, even sugar. Then, almost as a joke, he added fat. He stared at the word. Fat. The pencil lingered there, motionless. Outside, the wind howled like distant engines, and for a moment, just a fleeting second, he imagined the smell of smoke and frying oil mixing in the air. He shook his head and turned the lamp lower. It was nonsense. No one ran a plane on kitchen scraps. But the thought didn't leave him. It followed him into his dreams. That night, he dreamed of engines breathing again, coughing, roaring, alive. The exhaust thick with the scent of something strange, something familiar. When he woke, the morning was colder. The mist was so dense it felt alive, curling through the broken panes of the workshop. He pulled on his coat, shivering, and stepped outside. The cooks were already at work, their laughter muffled by the clang of pans. Behind the kitchen, barrels sat half open, filled with slop and grease from the night before. He caught the scent as he passed. Heavy, oily, unmistakably flammable. He stopped, looked back. The puddle beneath the barrels shimmered faintly, catching the early light. It was the same rainbow sheen he'd seen on the tarmac days ago. He crouched, dipping his finger into it. The texture was thick, almost sticky. He rubbed it between his fingers, slippery, smooth, slow to wash away. He sniffed it. Beneath the stench of waste, he smelled something else. Potential. The thought struck him not like lightning, but like a whisper. What if? He stood there for a long time, the kitchen noise fading into the background. And then he turned, walking back toward the hangar. His boots left a trail of prints in the wet earth, each one firmer than the last. Back at his bench, he didn't write a word. He simply took an empty jar and set it beside the others. He looked at it, clean waiting. Then, slowly, he smiled. The day's work hadn't even begun. And yet something inside him had shifted. He didn't know if it was madness or genius. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to belief. The war outside still raged. The engines still slept. But in that small, forgotten workshop on the English coast, a new kind of fire was about to be born. The next morning began like every other. A dull hum of generators somewhere far off, the crackle of a radio coughing static, the taste of cold tea in a metal cup. But inside Thomas Hale's mind, something had changed. The idea refused to fade. He waited until the kitchen crew cleared out after breakfast. Then, with his sleeves rolled up and his jaw set, he carried an empty canister across the muddy courtyard. The barrels behind the mess hall stood like sentinels, their lids half open, steam rising faintly from the cooling grease inside. He plunged a metal scoop into one of them. The sludge clung to it like melted wax, thick, golden brown and foul-smelling. He poured it into the canister, sealing it tight. The air filled with the scent of burnt fat and salt. It wasn't pleasant, but it was alive, volatile, promising. Back in his workshop, he placed the canister on the bench and just looked at it. This is madness, he whispered to himself. And yet, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Excitement. He rigged a small burner, nothing more than a repurposed blowtorch and a length of copper tubing. He poured a thin stream of the grease into a glass dish, set the flame beneath it, and waited. The smell intensified as the liquid warmed. It began to shimmer, bubble. Then smoke. Thomas leaned closer, eyes squinting through the haze. Then, a flash. A tongue of flame leapt across the surface. He flinched back, heart pounding, then slowly smiled. It burned. Imperfectly, unevenly, but it burned. He noted the temperature, the ignition time, the residue. Every detail mattered. He repeated the test again and again. Heating, filtering, skimming the black crust from the top. He found that once the impurities were gone, the flame steadied. The color changed, from dirty orange to clean blue. He didn't eat that day, didn't sleep that night. By dusk, his table was lined with test jars, each labeled in pencil B1, B2, B3, every one a new blend. Different filters, ratios, methods of refinement. His notebook, filled with hurried notes, combusts readily at low vaporization point. Possible additives required. High viscosity. Consider dilution. He wasn't sure what he was creating, but he could feel the path forming beneath his hands. The next morning, the base was buzzing with rumors. Another convoy had been lost at sea. Fuel shortages now reached the front lines. The officers barked orders, the men grew restless. Thomas barely noticed. He was already too deep in his work. He scavenged parts from old engines, pipes, even medical equipment, anything that could serve as a makeshift filter or distillation coil. The workshop became a labyrinth of glass, rubber, and wire. At night, the light from his lamps flickered through the windows like a heartbeat, visible from across the airfield. When one of the mechanics, a young corporal named Reeves, stopped by to check on him, he wrinkled his nose at the stench. Good Lord, Hale. Smells like a butcher's bin in here. Thomas just smiled faintly. That's the smell of progress. Reeves shook his head. If you say so. Just don't blow us all to hell. By the third day, Thomas had managed to create a liquid that burned clean for several minutes without leaving heavy soot. He mixed in a small amount of ethanol from the medical stores, thinning the consistency until it resembled traditional fuel. He poured the mixture into a small test engine, a single-cylinder prototype salvage from an old generator. He connected the lines, adjusted the valve, and braced himself. He turned the crank once, twice. The engine coughed, A sputter of smoke escaped, followed by silence. He adjusted the air intake, tried again. The engine wheezed, coughed, then suddenly it caught. The sound was weak but real. The piston moved. The smell filled the air, acrid, greasy, unmistakably new. He stared in disbelief as the engine chugged to life. It ran for 9 seconds before dying. But for Thomas, those 9 seconds were everything. He stepped back, hands trembling. He wanted to shout, to run, to tell someone, anyone, that it worked. But when the silence returned, he felt something else. Fear. He knew how the officers would react. They would laugh. Kitchen grease. They'd say, "You've lost your mind, Hale." No, he thought. Not yet. Not until it was perfect. He worked through the night again, refining the mixture, purifying the waste, creating a crude filtration process using charcoal and strips of cloth. He learned to separate the usable oil from the sludge. He learned its moods, how it thickened in the cold, how it burned cleaner when mixed with small amounts of spirit. Every discovery came at a cost. Burnt fingers, ruined notes, a lab that smelled perpetually of smoke and tallow. But he didn't stop. When dawn arrived, the first rays of light cut through the fog and fell on his exhausted face. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling. But he was smiling. The base awoke to the sound of coughing engines. Not from the flight line, but from Hale's workshop. Men gathered at the doorway, drawn by curiosity. They watched as the small prototype rattled and shook, its exhaust spitting a faint trail of blue smoke. "What in God's name is that?" someone asked. "Grease," Thomas said, barely above a whisper. "It's running on grease." Laughter broke out. Someone clapped sarcastically. Another shook his head and walked away. But a few stayed, watching, listening, waiting as the engine kept running longer than any of them expected. Thomas didn't argue. He didn't need to. The sound was proof enough. When the engine finally stopped, he exhaled, feeling both triumph and exhaustion wash over him. His throat was raw from the fumes, his skin reeked of burnt oil. But inside, something had ignited that no laughter could extinguish. For the next several days, he refined his creation in secret. He built larger filters, cleaner mixtures, and eventually a small tank of usable fuel, as he called it in his notes. The smell of it lingered everywhere he went, faint, greasy, defiant. Then came the visit he had been dreading. Colonel Barrett returned, his coat still damp from the rain. "Ale," he said, stepping into the workshop. "You're past your deadline." Thomas straightened. "I've found something, sir." Barrett raised an eyebrow. "I've heard that before." Without another word, Thomas turned the crank on the test engine. It sputtered, caught, and ran. The colonel stared, arms crossed. "What fuel are you using?" Thomas hesitated. Then he said it plainly. "Wast grease, sir. From the kitchens." Barrett blinked. For a moment there was silence, then laughter. Low, disbelieving. "You're serious?" "Yes, sir. Grace," Barrett repeated. "You think we're going to fly bombers on bacon drippings?" Thomas didn't answer. The engine was still running, steady, rhythmic, alive. He simply stood beside it, the noise filling the room like a heartbeat. The colonel's expression shifted. Amusement turned to curiosity. He stepped closer, examining the exhaust. "It burns clean," he muttered. "Yes, sir," Thomas said quietly. "Cleaner than standard fuel in some cases. It needs refinement. But it works." Barrett didn't respond immediately. He just watched, the skepticism in his eyes fading, replaced by something else. The faint glimmer of belief. Finally, he said, "Keep working, Hale. But for God's sake, keep it quiet. If London hears we're running the war on fry grease, they'll have my head." Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir." When the colonel left, Thomas sank onto a stool, exhaling hard. The engine finally sputtered out, leaving the workshop in silence once more. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't defeat. It was anticipation. He stared at the darkened window, the fog pressing against the glass, and whispered to himself, "It works." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of smoke and salt. Inside, the engineer sat among his notes, surrounded by the smell of burnt fat. the scent of invention. He didn't know how far this idea would go. He didn't know if anyone would ever believe him. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world was running out of fuel, and he had found a way to keep it moving. As night fell again over the English coast, the distant waves beat against the cliffs. The war raged on beyond the horizon, and in one small workshop, a tired man stared at a flickering flame. A flame fed by waste, by hope, by the remnants of yesterday's meals. He leaned forward, watching it dance, hearing the echo of engines that might one day live again. When fuel ran out, he murmured, "We'll find another way." The flame trembled, then steadied, burning brighter. And as the light filled the room, Thomas Hale, the man the war had nearly forgotten, smiled for the first time in months. Because in that moment, he understood salvation doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes, it begins with the quiet burn of kitchen grease. Rain drummed against the tin roof of the workshop, steady and cold. The sound had become the rhythm of Thomas Hale's life. A dull, unending percussion marking the passage of days. He barely noticed it now. His focus was consumed by a single truth: his discovery worked, but no one truly believed it yet. The days following the first success were restless. Each hour carried new demands, new tests, new doubts. He'd done the impossible, created fire from waste. Yet to the men around him, it was still just a fluke. The word luck followed him like a shadow. In the officers' quarters, they called it Hale's folly. A joke whispered between rations. The man's trying to win the war with breakfast grease. But the laughter didn't matter. The real pressure came from elsewhere, from headquarters, from supply chains collapsing one after another. Every telegram carried the same urgency: no fuel, no progress. The colonel began visiting daily now, his tone sharpened by sleepless nights and orders from above. Headquarters wants numbers, Hale. Proof. If we can't make it work at scale, it's worthless. Thomas nodded, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. I just need more time. Time's a luxury we don't have, Barrett snapped. Then, more quietly, if this fails, they'll shut us down. All of it. The words hung heavy in the room, mingling with the scent of burnt oil and damp paper. That night, Thomas didn't go back to his cot. He stayed hunched over the workbench, studying his mixtures under the trembling glow of a single lamp. The flame had gone from inspiration to obsession. Every fraction of a second mattered. Every measurement could mean the difference between life and failure. His notebooks filled with smudged calculations, viscosity readings, ignition temperatures, pressure ratios. His fingers were cracked and stained black, his nails lined with soot. Sleep had become a memory, replaced by caffeine and sheer defiance. The men in the hangar could hear him through the night. The whine of valves, the sputter of test engines, sometimes the muted sound of a man swearing at his own limits. It wasn't just work anymore. It was war within war, one fought with chemistry, not bullets. He'd begun refining the grease through makeshift filters cloth. Charcoal, even crushed limestone. Each attempt made the liquid cleaner, clearer, more stable. He started mixing small batches of ethanol to thin it for better atomization. The smell had shifted too, less rancid, more sharp, almost metallic. But perfection was a ghost that refused to be caught. One miscalculation, one speck of impurity, and the mixture turned volatile. Twice that week, small explosions shook the workshop, leaving the walls blackened and his eyebrows singed. Each time, the soldiers rushed in, only to find Hale standing amid the smoke, coughing but alive, staring at the wreckage with the calm of a man who'd already seen worse. Just a pressure misread, he'd say. Back to work. They started calling him the mad mechanic. He didn't care. The madness was necessary. Days blurred into nights. Letters from home went unopened. Meals were forgotten. Even the steady march of boots outside his window began to fade into the background hum of his obsession. And still, he wasn't fast enough. On the fourth morning, Barrett arrived with another telegram in hand. His face was grim. Command sending an inspector. 2 days from now. Thomas froze. An inspection. Official evaluation, Barrett said. They want proof of progress. Real proof, field demonstration, operational results. If you can't show it, they'll pull the project. Thomas felt the air leave his chest. 2 days isn't enough. It's all you've got, Barrett replied. He paused, looking at the suit-streaked engineer. I want you to succeed, Hale, but they won't listen to Faith. They want fuel, and they want it now. When the colonel left, the silence inside the workshop felt suffocating. Thomas sat there, staring at the wall, the rain outside merging with the echo of his heartbeat. The idea that had once burned so brightly now flickered under the weight of bureaucracy. He rubbed his temples, his hands trembling. He could feel exhaustion pulling at him, whispering that it was hopeless. But he'd come too far to stop. He stood, straightened his coat, and went back to work. He set up another test, a scaled-down version of an aircraft fuel line, a glass tube, a small pump, a jet valve. He poured the mixture into the reservoir, whispering to himself as though speaking might tame the elements. The first ignition failed, pressure too high. The second, too low. The third, the flame caught for a second, then sputtered out. He clenched his fists, slamming the valve shut. The clang echoed through the room. His hands shook as he leaned on the table, breath shallow. For a moment, he thought of giving in, just walking away. But then he remembered the faces of the pilots grounded outside, the machines that would never fly again, the war choking in silence. Failure wasn't an option. Not anymore. He adjusted the pressure regulator, modified the intake, and tried again. This time the flame caught steady. The mixture burned cleaner. He recorded every second, every pulse of the engine, every tremor of vibration. He was racing the clock now, not just the science. By midnight, he had achieved a burn time of nearly a minute. Not perfect, but proof enough to show potential. It wasn't just luck anymore. It was chemistry obeying his will. He slumped back, sweat glistening on his forehead, the lamp flickering low. His body screamed for rest, but his mind refused. He began writing a list. Everything he needed before the inspector arrived: cleaner filtration, pressure stabilization, consistent ignition. The handwriting blurred, his vision swimming. But he forced the pen to move. Outside, thunder rolled across the coast. The rain came harder, washing over the base, turning the runways to rivers of mud. He looked out through the grimy window. Beyond the hangar, the skeletal shapes of bombers loomed in the dark, silent, waiting. He wondered how much longer they could wait. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion, a thought began to form, not of machines, but of people. Of how much they all depended on those engines coming alive again. This wasn't about fuel anymore.